Okay, so we're going to continue our deep dive into HEMA by today exploring the differences between modern and historical fencing. So, this was kind of brought up in a conversation that was regarding small sword and foil or epee. And the basic statement that I made was that opposition was more prevalent, or at least was more at the core of small sword than it is in the modern weapon. So, that was one thing of differentiating. Specifically, I was talking about the process of like finding the sword, gaining the sword, winning the sword, and how that's really at the core of the basic attacks versus in epee and foil, specifically foil. Oftentimes you'll see attacks in absence of blade, though not always. And this kind of brought up a huge big picture philosophical question, which is what's the difference? You know, is there differences? And if so, like why? So I want you to think of reality. This is a crazy video, but I want you to think of reality as this big, big thing, right? Say a giant bubble, and maybe the reality of swordsmanship specifically. And that's something that none of us will ever know. The historical masters didn't know it, believe it or not, but nobody really understood the full reality of it, and we still don't today. So within that reality of swordsmanship, there are other little bubbles, if you could picture that. So the next big one would be the idea of swordsmanship, right? So there's reality and then there's swordsmanship. And underneath that might be fencing, right? Specifically, because there's a layer where this applies to every weapon. So it could be kendo, it could be any martial art where people are fighting with swords. And there's a reality to that that they all share. And that's why sometimes you'll hear masters saying there's only one art. There's only one art of swordsmanship. And they're right in that. But that said, our reality is different. Our reality isn't reality. It's the reality that we all agree upon exists, specifically for HEMA, but also for fencing, for swordsmanship, even back in the day. And believe it or not, even for sword fights with sharps. So, what do I mean by that? So, typically, what we're talking about is the science of arms or the art, right? That's what they talk about a lot. And when they're doing that, they're talking about something that is not reality. So, what they're talking about is the art of hitting without being hit, the art of self preservation. So, you might be asking, like, how is that different from our real sword fight? And it is, it's very different. The reason that it's so different is because there are a lot of different contexts, to use an overused HEMA word, that swordsmanship happens in. So it could be on the battlefield, could be, you know, in a cell, could be for self-defense. It could be actually for offense. It could be for an assassination, something like that, right? But there are all these different realities for using a sport as well that exist within that. In many of those contexts, sometimes it is not about self-preservation. So maybe there's situations where you're using swordsmanship in order just to offend, and the goal might be only to attack. It might be only to unalive the target, right? In which case, you could be like an assassin, something like that. And we'll just picture this as like a video game, right? You could be an assassin, and maybe your family will be rewarded greatly, even if you perish. Or it could be that you have strong religious beliefs, right? Where if you are unalived in this process, you'll go to heaven or go to Valhalla or whatever it is, right? And those are realities, right? So the art of swordsmanship was not just about self-preservation. It is beyond that. The art and the science that we learn is about that. And so that's a fundamental rule. So if you were maybe like a samurai in Japan, maybe you would gladly take a hit to give an ending hit to an enemy because of your religious beliefs. Maybe you were highly motivated. Maybe life wasn't just about you, but it was about your honor or what it could bring to your family. So, us saying that the art is about hitting and not being hit, that's like a contract. We're creating a reality and it's not reality. So, we have to kind of accept that what we're aiming for is not reality. It's a sub reality that we're all agreeing upon. But with historical fencing and with sport fencing, they're very different and they're also very much the same. Most of historical fencing was for sport. Most of the time that people were doing it, majority of the time they were training and they were not fighting. So when you think about masters like Fiore or you think about 133, the treaties, most of the time they were training with those swords and they were fighting with them less of the time. So say you were a master and you had 50 fights with sharps. How many fights do you think you would have had in the salle or in your training hall with safe weapons? Now, people will make the argument that it was a much more brutal sport, and they're right, right? And so what you can compare this to is fencing back in the day was more like hockey than it was like soccer, right? So what I mean by that is it was rougher. People would get into fights. They would genuinely hurt each other. And that was a culture that was kind of somewhat accepted, maybe not at the Salle, but definitely in tournaments. Like if you look at Thibaut, the famous Destreza master, or I don't know if he really called it Destreza, but that's what it was. The tournament that he fought in, it would have been very different from a modern fencing tournament in that there wouldn't have been masks on. It would have been rougher. There would have been grappling. And so that context is different, but that context is also very different from a fight with sharps. It's very different from war in the battlefield. It's different than an assault. It's different than a duel. All of those things are different. And so each one of those different contexts have different emphasis. A tournament back then could have been about more than just winning. So it also could be, if you think about Bolognese fencers, right? It could have also been putting on a display of skill to show that you're tough, right? Or you're skilled. Or if you think about duels with épée, it could be showing up to basically make it seem like you're not backing down. A big part of it was not losing face, or it might have been impressing other people or showing that you have honor, even more than just fencing to hit and not be hit. There are other things that are going on underneath that. So with historical fencing and sport fencing, there are massive overlaps. That means that the majority of, if you look at small sword sources, 90% of what they teach is in sport fencing. So I'm talking about, like, if you look at the demi-volte, or you guys might know it as an incortada, but it's a void. That's in sport fencing. It's called an esquive, or sometimes still an incortada. Talk about opposition, right? Or taking the blade. All of those things are in sport fencing still. So they can still teach you the mechanics of it. They can still teach you how to, the when and the why, like why you would do it. All of that is still retained. The tradition is unbroken. What changes is emphasis, and emphasis is determined by the reality that we create for each other with the rules, but also our context. So like having gear versus maybe not having gear, which dramatically impacts things. And also what we're trying to show changes, right? So for modern fencing, it's to get the hit, right? And so they don't really care what they look like anymore because they're not being judged by that. They're not being judged by form. Whereas somebody in the 1700s, they might have been, as like a noble person engaging in a contest. You were not just trying to get the hit. You were also trying to look good in front of people, right? Or even for demonstrations. It was largely watched, and it was a very important thing in society. It meant something very different then than it does now. So when we like go into the micro now, when we're talking about specifically small sword and maybe foil, let's compare it to foil. So yes, foil has opposition. And yes, still there's that overarching reality, right? Which is hit and don't be hit is in foil, because that's the best way to win, is just to hit and not be hit. That said, there's an easier way of doing that. And the easier way of doing that is relying upon the judging, right? Because that'll still get me the point. So in modern foil, what it really looks like is a slight extension of the arm. So maybe 2 to 3 inches. And the arm doesn't have to be extended to get priority. It just has to be extending. So you begin with that with your motion forward. And then after that, you can double. And if you double, if you're the person with priority, you get the win. And sometimes that's, I would say a lot of the time, that's the easiest way to get the touch. That's the easiest way to achieve your goals. And for that context, it works. And it's still highly skilled. But that's not something that works in a historical fencing context for most of the time. You know, maybe you could argue in the 1900s, but even then it had to be a fully extended arm to get right away versus an extending one. But most of the time that doesn't achieve the same goal. It doesn't work. If you compare that to small sword in, say, the 1700s, what you'll find is that they're gradually transitioning to wearing masks, but a lot of times they're not. And so that process that was just like rapier of finding the sword, engaging the sword without pressure, but pointing it off to the side, and then hitting after all of those steps are done first is predominant. And you can imagine why, that without a mask, right, you don't want to get poked in the eye. So that's a huge motivator, even in a sporting context. And that's not to say historical fencing is better, because it isn't. In a lot of ways, sport fencing has achieved more than the masters of the past. And we can know this by video footage. Like, you can compare video footage of the late 1800s, compare it to now, or even the early 1900s and compare it to now. People have gotten way, way more skilled at it, and they understand fencing better. Fencing has become clearer. The language has become clearer. They have better ways of understanding it, but the game is ultimately very different from how it was. So when I say preference, or the core of things, the preference for small sword would be to go through that process of finding opposition before launching an attack. The preference for foil oftentimes is to land the hit and to get priority. When I'm talking about preference, I'm not saying that that isn't in small sword or that isn't in foil. They fully have the same curriculum, right? I'm just talking about a hierarchy of decisions that you'd want to make given the context. If we use another comparison, which would be like Highland broadsword or saber, military saber compared to modern saber, the main attacks that you'd see in modern saber is a cut to the head, a cut to the flank, and maybe some attacks to the arm. Those are kind of the main attacks. In general, they start running off right away, trying to get priority, crash into each other, and the person who started first gets the point. In Highland broadsword, it's a completely different context. So what you're initially trying to do is it's a slow pace, because it's almost like epee or foil today, where there's a slow pace, and you would almost need, like today, you need to penalize people for going too slow. Broadsword tended to be a slow pace, right? A lot of preparatory actions, and it mostly was a second intention game. The core attack, like the core basic attack that you would try to get on somebody, was generally they used guards that were engaged. And so it would be a disengage and hit with opposition. That was the main thing that you would attack with. Second to that, so second to the hits with opposition, the next thing that they say would be a hit to the arm was a preferred method. And the reason is because the distance is farther away. You don't have opposition, but a hit to the arm is really, really safe. And then there's an added layer that they all discuss, a lot of the masters discuss, which is disabling somebody on the arm is better than killing them. And so that was a factor that they had to think about back then on the battlefield, in stage gladiator fights, in dueling, in self-defense, is that most of them were Christian. So they had this other layer to it, and they discussed that in depth, that it was more Christian to wound somebody and spare their life than it was to kill them. And that's a very different attitude that you see in many other sources that were intended for dueling, where the goal was a thrust to the torso, which was ultimately death. Highland broadsword is very different than that. And yet in modern saber, you still see cuts with opposition. It's done mechanically almost the same way. Maybe the one thing that's changed a little bit is the use of the moulinet, because you don't have to worry about cutting through targets with modern sport fencing. It can be a light touch, and that's great for training, right? And those small direct attacks are still in Highland broadsword. They're stop cuts or just little direct attacks. They're used all the time. I think they're called timing cuts, according to Thomas Page. But that said, they all exist inside of each other. And that's why sport fencing is so, so valuable, but it has a different hierarchy of decision making. So what we do today is something different from both of those things. It's very different from historical fencing in that we're using modern gear. And it's very different than sport fencing in that we are in a different culture, right? So other things may be important. Maybe you don't want to be ridiculed. Maybe you won't flesh because you don't want to be ridiculed. Or maybe the expectation is that you use a very historical guard that has a back-weighted stance and stuff like that. And there's pressures on you to do so because you want to be considered artful. In many ways, that would be similar to what historical fencers felt at the time, because they wanted, some of them, depending on the context, they may have wanted to present a certain way because they might have been upper class, or they may have been a fencing master that was trying to get work when they were doing a duel between fencing masters, which had a different kind of rule set than other ones. If you look at like the period of rapier, both of these have overlap. They have huge overlap, and they all belong to that category of like reality is the outer category, swordsmanship, and then like there's principles that they share. So like blade position, having a blade position advantage. That's more important in both sport fencing and historical fencing because it's reality. Same thing with timing. That's reality. You're more likely to get a point. You're more likely to get a touch or a wound on the opponent if you use timing. Same thing with body position. You see that in like, I was talking about Delatouche earlier, and you see him going to these really low lunges, right? That's body positioning to keep yourself safe. And then we did timing, blade position, body position, and then distance would be the final one, which is that's a reality. Is it a reality across martial arts? Is that the person who's in control of the distance that enters the critical distance, the dangerous distance, when they choose to on their initiative, they'll usually win out. And so if you combine that with a lot of the knowledge from sport fencing, which has made historical fencing clearer in some ways, it's made some advances on it, the theory. That's things like the tactical wheel. It's things like discussing preparation. It's things like second intention that existed very clearly in Highland Broadsword, because that's the game plan that, say, Zachary Wild lays out for people as second intention fencing, where he tests their guard, sees what they do, like does reconnaissance, and then decides what attack to do. It's very clearly second intention fencing. It's beautiful, but it's not as clearly explained as it is later on. Now we have better language to describe that. So what I'd say is they're both super valuable and they're both necessary in 2026 to get to the top, or to get the most value, actually, I think, out of your training. There will be less frustration. So while I think it's important to say that like there's overlap, and I think most of pretty much everything that you see done in the sources is contained in sport fencing, minus, certain specific weapons or some tendencies, and those are really fun to explore and figure out. I think the core of them are the same, but different at the same time. The emphasis is different because just of the context that they were used in, to use the favorite word of HEMA is, but it's true. And neither one of those are reality. Neither historical fencing nor sport fencing are reality, or what we do. It's not reality at all. Hope you enjoyed the crazy video. Kind of another conspiracy theory that I have, but it explains the way that I see fencing.